The fluorescent lights above me flickered as I signed my own surgical consent forms, my hands trembling so badly the pen nearly slipped from my fingers. No mother holding my hand, no father pacing the waiting room, no sister rushing through the doors. Just me alone at 11 p.m. with a ruptured ovarian cyst and internal bleeding that the doctor said could have killed me if I'd waited 2 more hours. I called them, I texted them, I watched every message turn from delivered to read. They never came. 3 days later, still healing from emergency surgery, I finally got a text from my mother. Not, "How are you feeling?" Not, "I'm so sorry we weren't there." Instead, "Stop overreacting. This is important. I need $8,500 for Emily's engagement dinner. The Morrisons need to see we're a respectable family." My hands went cold. My stitches still ached, and something inside me finally broke. But not the way they expected. Because what my parents didn't know was that their little scheme was about to unravel, starting with a single phone call that would change everything. Have you ever realized your family saw you as a bank account? Instead of a daughter, my name is Nicole Jennings. I'm 36 years old, a senior financial analyst at a respected firm in the city, and until recently, I believed that being a good daughter meant never saying no. I learned to hide my success from my family the way some people learn to hide bruises. Not because I was ashamed of what I'd accomplished, but because every achievement I shared became an invoice they expected me to pay. 5 years ago, when I excitedly told my parents about my promotion and the raise that came with it, my mother's first response wasn't congratulations. It was, "That's wonderful, honey. Emily needs help with her car payment. You know how she struggles." That night, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. Dad's voice carried through the pew walls. "Nicole's doing well now. We can count on her when we need things. Not when we need her, when we need things." I stopped sharing my success after that. But I couldn't stop giving when they asked. Every time I tried to say no, Mom would call with that signature disappointed sigh. "I guess we'll figure it out somehow." I just thought family helped family. The guilt of refusing felt worse than the resentment of complying. So I transferred the money and told myself this would be the last time. It was never the last time. In 5 years, I gave them $47,000, $15,000 for Emily's wedding fund when she was engaged the first time, which fell apart 6 months later, $8,000 for my parents' credit card debt twice, $5,000 for their roof, $4,000 for Emily's car, countless small emergencies that were never really emergencies at all. Not once did they say thank you. Not once did they acknowledge that my sacrifice was anything other than my obligation. My sister Emily is 4 years younger than me, and she has always been what my parents call the heart of this family. Pretty charming, effortlessly likable. When she started dating Marcus Morrison, whose family owns half the commercial real estate in the county, my parents acted like they'd won the lottery. Every conversation became about Emily's future, Emily's wedding, Emily's opportunity. The Morrisons were refined. The Morrisons were wealthy. The Morrisons needed to be impressed. I noticed I'd been excluded from a new family group chat. When I asked Mom about it, she laughed. "Oh, it's just wedding planning stuff. You'd find it boring." But one evening at their house, I overheard Dad on the phone. His voice was low, confident. "Don't worry about the amount. Nicole won't even notice. She makes good money." I assumed it was about some small favor and let it go. I had no idea they'd already promised the Morrisons $20,000 in my name. The only person who ever made me feel like I mattered without a price tag was Mrs. Patterson, the 68-year-old widow who lived next door. I'd been helping her for years, driving her to doctor's appointments, fixing things around her house, sharing dinners when neither of us wanted to eat alone. Last year, after I'd spent an hour crying over another guilt-fueled money transfer, she held my hand and said something I've never forgotten. "Honey, you're more of a daughter to me than my own kids who never call, and I would never ask you for a dime. Just your company." I quietly changed my emergency contact on all my medical forms to her name. I told myself it was practical. Deep down, I knew it was because I couldn't count on my own family. A week before everything changed, I texted my mother about the abdominal pain that had been getting worse. She replied 6 hours later, "Take some Tylenol. We're finalizing things with the Morrisons. So exciting for our family." That evening, Dad called, not to ask how I was feeling, but to remind me the engagement party was in 6 weeks. "Dress nicely," he said. "The Morrisons are very refined." He said "our family" 3 times. He never once said "you." That night, as I hung up the phone, a wave of pain hit me so hard I doubled over. This wasn't stress. Something was very, very wrong. The pain didn't stop. It grew teeth. By 10 o'clock that night, I was on my bathroom floor, curled into myself, trying to breathe through waves of agony that felt like something inside me was tearing apart. I couldn't stand. I couldn't think. I tried to reach my phone on the counter, but my legs wouldn't hold me. Somehow, I crawled to my front door, pulled myself up using the handle, and stumbled outside into the cool night air. Mrs. Patterson's porch light was on. It was always on. I made it to her door and banged with whatever strength I had left. When she opened it, I saw her face change instantly. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She took one look at my gray skin and the sweat soaking through my shirt, and she called 911 before I could even speak. I remember her voice calm but urgent, giving them my address. I remember her hands guiding me to sit on her steps. I remember thinking that this woman who owed me nothing was the only person in my life who showed up without being asked. The ambulance arrived within minutes. The paramedics lifted me onto a stretcher and started asking questions I could barely answer. In the back of that ambulance, with an oxygen mask over my face and sirens wailing above me, I did what any daughter would do. I called my mother. Voicemail. I called my father. Voicemail. I called Emily. Voicemail. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type, but I managed to send each of them the same message: I'm in an ambulance. Going to ER. Something is wrong. Please come. I watched my mother's message go from delivered to read. I stared at that screen, waiting for the 3 dots that would tell me she was typing back. They never appeared. The paramedic asked if someone would be meeting me at the hospital. I couldn't answer him. At the emergency room, everything moved fast. Doctors surrounded me, asking about my pain, pressing on my abdomen, ordering scans. The diagnosis came quickly: ruptured ovarian cyst with significant internal bleeding. The doctor who explained it to me was a woman about my age with kind eyes and a direct voice. She said if I had waited another 2 hours, they might not have been able to stop the bleeding. She said I was lucky my neighbor acted so quickly. Lucky, I almost laughed. I was lying in an emergency room about to be cut open, and the only person who knew I was there was a 68-year-old widow who wasn't even related to me. A nurse came with consent forms. She asked if there was family she could contact. I told her I had tried everyone. She looked at my phone, saw the read receipts with no responses, and wrote something on her clipboard. Later, I would learn what she documented: multiple contact attempts to family members, all read no response. Patient's neighbor listed as emergency contact. Consent signed independently. I signed those forms myself, my hand trembling, tears streaming down my face that I couldn't wipe away because there was an IV in my arm. That signature was the loneliest thing I have ever done. No mother holding my hand, no father telling me it would be okay, no sister rushing through the doors, just me alone, authorizing strangers to cut me open and hoping I would wake up. Mrs. Patterson stayed. She sat in that waiting room for 4 hours while I was in surgery. A woman with arthritis in her knees and a heart condition that required her to rest sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair in the middle of the night because she refused to leave me alone. My family never came, not during the surgery, not after, not once. What I didn't know then, what I would piece together later, was exactly where my family was while I was bleeding on an operating table. They were at an upscale Italian restaurant downtown, seated at a private table with the Morrisons. This was the dinner they had been planning for weeks. The dinner where they would cement their image as worthy future in-laws. The dinner that mattered more than their daughter's life. My mother checked her phone at 7:43 p.m. I know this because I saw the raid receipt later. She saw my message about being in an ambulance. She saw the words, "Something is wrong," and "Please come." And she put her phone away. Emily noticed and asked if everything was okay. My mother waved her hand dismissively and said it was just Nicole being dramatic. She said I probably had a stomachache and wanted attention. My father didn't even look up from his menu. 20 minutes later, they ordered appetizers. An hour after that, while surgeons were trying to stop my internal bleeding, my father raised his wine glass and told Richard Morrison that he believed in family supporting family. He said both his daughters were contributing to help Emily's new chapter. My mother added that I especially had done so well for myself and that I insisted on being generous. They were selling my money to strangers while I was fighting for my life. Linda Morrison, I would later learn, noticed something that night. She noticed that my parents talked about my money, but never about me. She filed that observation away and said nothing. I woke up at 3 in the morning, groggy from anesthesia, my abdomen wrapped in bandages, and throbbing with a deep surgical ache. The room was dim. Monitors beeped softly beside me. And there, asleep in the chair next to my bed, was Mrs. Patterson. Her head was tilted at an uncomfortable angle, and her hand rested near mine on the blanket. She had stayed the entire time. She hadn't left me alone for a single moment. I reached for my phone on the bedside table. There were 47 unread messages in the family group chat. Emily had added me earlier that day, probably by accident. I scrolled through them with a strange detached feeling, like I was watching someone else's life. Photos of wine glasses clinking, selfies with the Morrisons, everyone smiling, messages about how perfect the evening was, how impressed the Morrisons seemed, how this was going to change everything for Emily. My mother had typed, "They were so impressed with us," with 3 exclamation points. Not a single message mentioned me. Not one person asked why I hadn't responded to the group chat. My emergency texts sat in their individual conversations, read and ignored like receipts for a transaction no one intended to complete. The timestamp on my mother's read receipt glowed on the screen, 7:43 p.m. 20 minutes before appetizers. Mrs. Patterson stirred and opened her eyes. She saw me looking at my phone and reached over to take my hand. Her grip was warm and steady, the grip of someone who had chosen to be there. "How are you feeling, honey?" she asked softly. I stared at the screen in my other hand, at the photos of my family laughing and toasting while I was unconscious on a table, at the messages they sent each other, celebrating their success, never once wondering if I was alive or dead. "I almost died," I whispered, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, and they didn't even pause dinner. Mrs. Patterson didn't say anything. She just held my hand tighter, and in that moment, lying in a hospital bed, with stitches in my body and evidence of betrayal glowing on my phone, I didn't feel sad. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the familiar ache of wanting them to love me. I felt something colder, clearer, harder. I felt the truth settling into my bones like ice water, and I knew that something inside me had changed forever. 10 days passed. The stitches in my abdomen were healing, but something else inside me had hardened into something I didn't quite recognize yet. Mrs. Patterson came by every day with soup and conversation, checking my bandages, making sure I was eating. She never asked about my family. She had seen my face in the hospital room that night, and she understood there were some questions that didn't need to be spoken out loud. I spent those days in a strange kind of stillness, moving slowly through my apartment, sleeping more than I had in years, letting my body recover while my mind kept circling back to the same images. The read receipt at 7:43 p.m. The photos of clinking wine glasses, my mother's message about how impressed the Morrisons were. I had almost died, and they had ordered dessert. On the 10th day, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. I stared at it for a long time before I opened it. Part of me still hoped, even after everything, that she was finally reaching out to ask how I was, that she had realized what she had done and wanted to make it right. But the message waiting for me had nothing to do with my health or my surgery or the fact that her daughter had nearly bled to death alone. It said, "Nicole, Dad, and I need $8,500 for Emily's engagement party. We want to book the Carlton and hire a photographer. This is important for Emily's future. Can you transfer by Friday?" I read it 3 times, not a single word about my surgery, not one question about my recovery, not even the pretense of caring. Just a number and a deadline. I noticed the careful wording she used. Engagement party. Not wedding contribution, not the full amount, just this one specific thing with its own specific excuse. And then I remembered something my father had said on the phone weeks ago, the conversation I had overheard and dismissed. "Don't worry about the amount. Nicole won't even notice." What amount for what I called my mother? She answered on the first ring. Not like the night I was in the ambulance when she let it go to voicemail so she could enjoy her appetizers in peace. This time she picked up immediately because this time she wanted something. "Did you get my text?" she asked. "About the money." Her voice was bright, expectant, like we were discussing lunch plans instead of thousands of dollars. I kept my voice flat. "I was in emergency surgery, Mom. Did you see my messages?" There was a pause. I could almost hear her deciding how to handle this inconvenience. Then came the sigh, the same disappointed exhale. She had used my entire life to make me feel guilty for having needs. Nicole, please, don't be dramatic. You're clearly fine now. Emily's whole future is at stake here. The Morrisons are very wealthy. We need to show them we're not beneath them. I let her words hang in the air between us. She had just told me that impressing strangers mattered more than the fact that I almost died. She had said it out loud without shame, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. I asked her directly, "Is this $8,500 the only thing you'll need from me for this wedding?" The hesitation was barely half a second. Most people wouldn't have caught it, but I had spent my entire career analyzing data, reading patterns, catching the small inconsistencies that revealed larger truths, and I caught this one. "Let's just focus on this for now," she said carefully. That pause told me everything. There was more. There was a plan, and I was never supposed to know the full scope of it. After I hung up, I did something I should have done years ago. I approached my family the way I approach my work with data. I pulled 5 years of bank statements and spread them across my kitchen table. I categorized every transfer, every payment, every guilt-fueled transaction I had made to keep the peace. The total was worse than I remembered, $47,000. I stared at that number until it stopped feeling abstract and started feeling like theft. Then I started connecting the dots. The roof repair that Mom said would be $3,000, then required another $2,000 for unexpected issues. Emily's car that started as just help with the down payment and became the full $4,000. The first wedding that never happened, the one where just the deposit became $15,000 over 8 months as each new emergency appeared. Every request started small. Every request grew. They had been doing this for years, extracting money from me piece by piece, so I would never see the full picture. I said it out loud to my empty apartment, piece by piece. The $8,500 wasn't the ask. It was just the opening bid. I needed to know how much they had actually promised. So, I called Emily. I kept my voice carefully neutral, almost friendly, like I was just trying to be helpful. "I'm trying to budget for the wedding stuff," I said. "How much are Mom and Dad expecting me to contribute total?" Emily sounded uncomfortable. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know what. "I mean, they mentioned something about 20,000. They said you'd be happy to help since you're doing so well." $20,000. My stomach dropped. I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter and forced my voice to stay steady. "And did they tell the Morrisons this?" "I think so. Dad said something about wanting to show we're a family that takes care of our own." I thanked Emily and hung up calmly. Then I sat in silence for 10 minutes, letting the full scope of what they had done wash over me. $20,000. They had promised $20,000 in my name without my knowledge, without my consent to impress people I had never even met. The $8,500 was phase 1. There would have been a phase 2 and phase 3 each, with its own urgent excuse, its own emotional manipulation, its own carefully timed request. They were never going to ask me for $20,000 because they knew I would say no to a number that large. Instead, they were going to manage me, extract it slowly, keep me confused about the total so I would never realize I was funding their entire performance. For the first time in years, I didn't cry. I didn't call my mother back to ask why. I didn't try to explain my hurt in hopes that she would finally understand. Instead, I got to work. I screenshotted every money request from the past 5 years. I organized bank statements showing the pattern of extraction, the way small asks always grew into larger ones. I saved my medical records, the ones that documented multiple contact attempts and no response. The ones that noted I signed my own surgical consent because my family couldn't be bothered to show up. I found the timestamp that proved my mother read my emergency text at 7:43 p.m. and chose not to reply. I put it all in a folder on my computer and backed it up twice. Then I texted my mother back, keeping my response simple. "I'll give you my answer at the engagement party, in person." Her reply came almost immediately. "Wonderful. I knew we could count on you. Make sure you dress nicely. The Morrisons will be watching." I stared at that message for a long time. She had read my words and seen only what she wanted to see. She assumed I was falling in line the way I always had the obedient daughter who paid her guilt tax and never made waves. She had no idea that I wasn't preparing to give her money. I was preparing to give her the truth. My parents had built their entire scheme on one assumption that I would stay silent, stay guilty, stay useful. They never imagined I might stop playing along. In 4 weeks at the party, they were throwing with money they expected me to provide. I would give them exactly what they had earned. The 4 weeks passed slowly. My body healed completely, but I spent that time preparing in ways my parents never could have imagined. I reviewed my evidence folder every night, memorizing the details, the dates, the amounts. I practiced keeping my voice steady when I talked about what they had done. I wasn't preparing for a confrontation, I was preparing for a correction. The engagement party was scheduled for a Saturday evening at the Carlton, an upscale venue my parents had chosen specifically to impress the Morrisons. What my parents didn't realize was that they had charged over $6,000 to their credit cards to pay for this event, confident that I would reimburse them afterward, like I always had. They had already told the Morrisons multiple times that their daughter Nicole was generously contributing to help Emily start her new chapter. Family takes care of family, they said. Richard Morrison had apparently mentioned to colleagues how united the Jennings family seemed. Everyone believed the story my parents had been telling, because no one had any reason to doubt it. Except Linda Morrison. I would learn later that Linda had noticed something off in the weeks leading up to the party. Emily's answers about her older sister were inconsistent. My parents talked constantly about my money, but rarely about me as a person. So Linda did what any careful woman would do when her son was marrying into a family she didn't fully understand. She researched. She found my LinkedIn profile and saw my career trajectory, my education, my accomplishments. She found it strange that such an accomplished daughter seemed almost hidden by her own family. She arrived at that party with questions she hadn't yet asked out loud. I arrived 30 minutes late deliberately. I wanted them to wait. I wanted them to wonder. When I walked into the Carlton, I was calm in a way I had never been around my family before. I wore a simple black dress, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. I looked healthy, fully recovered, but I carried myself differently. There was something in my posture and my eyes that had changed. My parents were too relieved to see me to notice. My mother rushed over before I had even reached the table, her smile wide and desperate. "There you are. The Morrisons are so excited to meet you. Remember, we talked about your contribution?" I cut her off quietly, my voice pleasant but firm. "We'll discuss that later, Mom. I promise." She blinked, thrown off by my tone, but she recovered quickly and guided me to the table where the Morrisons were waiting. I was seated next to Linda Morrison, a woman in her early 60s, with sharp eyes and an elegant composure that reminded me of Mrs. Patterson. She watched the family dynamic with careful attention, saying little but observing everything. Dinner progressed with surface pleasantries. My father talked too much about business. My mother laughed too loudly at Richard Morrison's jokes. Emily sat quietly beside Marcus, looking nervous in a way that made me wonder how much she actually knew about what our parents had been doing. Linda kept engaging me with questions about my career, and I answered honestly. I told her about my work as a financial analyst, about my MBA, about the projects I had led. With each answer, I saw her glance at my parents, noticing that they seemed surprised by details they should have known about their own daughter. They had spent so many years seeing me as a source of money that they had forgotten to see me as a person with a life of my own. Linda noticed. She filed it away with all the other things she had noticed. Between the main course and dessert, my father raised his wine glass and cleared his throat. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when he would solidify everything he had built. "I'd like to thank the Morrisons for welcoming Emily into their family," he said, his voice warm and confident. "And I want to publicly thank our daughter Nicole, who has been so generous in supporting this celebration." He turned to me with a smile that expected compliance. "Nicole, would you like to tell everyone about the gift you're giving Emily and Marcus?" The table turned to look at me. My mother was beaming. Emily looked uncomfortable. Linda's expression was unreadable. My father had just handed me the microphone, confident that I would play my role the way I always had. He had no idea what he had just done. I set down my wine glass slowly. When I spoke, my voice was calm, almost curious. "I'm sorry, Dad. What gift are you referring to?" His smile flickered just for a moment. "The wedding contribution. The 20,000. I nodded slowly, as if this was new information I was processing. "Ah, the 20,000 you promised the Morrisons in my name without ever asking me." The silence that fell over the table was immediate and absolute. I continued before anyone could interrupt. I was never consulted about any wedding contribution. I was asked for $8,500 for party expenses. That request came 10 days after I had emergency surgery that required me to sign my own consent forms. Because no one in this family answered my calls or texts, I turned to look directly at Linda Morrison. Mrs. Morrison, my parents told you I insisted on contributing this money. I'd like to clarify something. I learned the actual number tonight from my father just now. This is the first time anyone has mentioned $20,000 to me. Linda's expression had gone cold. Not angry, not shocked, just cold in the way that people become when they realize they have been deceived. She turned to my parents. You told us this was Nicole's idea. You said she wanted to help. My mother's face had gone white. Nicole, this isn't the place. You're right, Mom. The place was the hospital 5 weeks ago, but you were here having dinner promising these people money I never agreed to give. I kept my voice steady, factual, like I was presenting data in a meeting. The hospital documented everything. Multiple contact attempts to family members, all read no response. I nearly bled out on an operating table while my family was telling yours how generous I am. Emily started crying quietly, her hands covering her face. My father opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time in my life, I saw him without words. Richard Morrison set down his napkin slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to something harder, something that looked like judgment. Linda spoke carefully, each word measured. Mr. and Mrs. Jennings, you told us your family was united. You told us Nicole was happy to contribute. Are you saying none of that was true? The silence stretched on. My parents looked at each other, then at the Morrisons, then at the table. They had no answer because any answer would be an admission. My mother tried anyway. This is a family misunderstanding. Linda stood up from her chair. Her movement was graceful but final. Richard, I think we should give the Jennings family some privacy. She turned to Emily and her voice softened just slightly. Emily, this isn't about you, but we need to have a serious conversation about what we've just witnessed. The Morrisons left without finishing their entrees. They didn't make a scene. They didn't raise their voices. They simply stood, collected themselves, and walked away from the table my parents had spent $6,000 to set. I watched my parents' faces as the people they most wanted to impress disappeared through the restaurant doors, taking their approval and their respect with them. After the Morrisons were gone, my mother turned to me. The mask of pleasantness had fallen away, completely replaced by a fury I had never seen directed at me so openly. Do you have any idea what you've done? I stood up from my chair and gathered my purse. My movements were unhurried, deliberate. I told the truth, I said. If the truth destroyed your plan, that's not my fault. I walked out of the Carlton without looking back. I left my parents sitting at a table set for celebration, surrounded by empty chairs and uneaten desserts and the wreckage of their own making. The night air outside was cool and clean. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing deeply, waiting for the guilt to arrive. It didn't come. For the first time in my life, I had told my family the truth, and I felt nothing but relief. The relief I felt that night outside the Carlton stayed with me in the days that followed. I had expected guilt to arrive eventually, the way it always had, after I disappointed my parents. But it never came. What came instead were consequences, and for once, they weren't mine to carry. Linda Morrison called Emily the next morning. I heard about the conversation later, pieced together from what Emily eventually told me. Linda's voice had been calm, but serious. She said the Morrisons didn't blame Emily for her parents' actions. Emily was not responsible for what her mother and father had done. But Linda needed to understand what kind of family Marcus was joining. A family that leaves one daughter dying alone while promising her money to impress strangers raises serious questions about character. She said they needed time to think about what they had witnessed. The wedding was postponed indefinitely, not canceled, but frozen in place while the Morrisons decided whether they could trust anything my parents had told them. The $6,200 my parents had charged to their credit cards for the party at the Carlton came due. For the first time in years, they faced a financial consequence they couldn't transfer to me. There was no phone call asking me to help with the bill. There was no guilt trip about how they had done this for the family and now they were struggling. They knew better than to ask. They paid it themselves, probably by going deeper into debt. And I felt nothing about that except a quiet recognition that this was always how it should have been. But worse than the money was the reputation. The Morrisons were well connected in our community. They didn't gossip maliciously or spread rumors with cruel intent. They simply didn't hide what had happened when people asked about the engagement party that ended so abruptly. Word spread the way it always does in social circles, where everyone knows everyone. The Jennings family isn't what they presented themselves to be. The older daughter was in the hospital while they were making promises in her name. The united family image was a performance. The generous contributions were lies. The reputation my parents had spent years cultivating collapsed in a matter of weeks. 3 days after the party, my parents appeared at my door. I saw them through the peephole and considered not answering, but I realized I didn't need to hide from them anymore. I opened the door, but didn't invite them inside. I stood in my doorway, calm and clear, and waited for them to speak. My mother's face was tight with fury she was barely containing. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" she said. "You humiliated us in front of everyone. You could have just paid quietly, and none of this would have happened." My father stepped forward, his voice harder than hers. "You need to call the Morrisons. Tell them you misunderstood. Tell them you were going to contribute and this was all a miscommunication." I looked at both of them standing on my doorstep, still trying to manage me, still believing they could pressure me into cleaning up their mess. "I have 5 years of bank statements," I said quietly. "They show $47,000 in transfers that you never once thanked me for. I have text messages showing you asking for money piece by piece, always with a new excuse, always just a little more. I have medical records documenting that you read my emergency messages and chose not to respond. I have the timestamp showing Mom read my text about being in an ambulance 20 minutes before you ordered appetizers." I paused and watched their faces change. "Would you like me to share any of that with the Morrisons?" The silence between us was heavy. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. My father looked away. "I'm not paying for the party," I continued. "I'm not paying for any wedding. I'm not your ATM anymore. If you want a relationship with me, it starts with a real apology, not for the party, for years of treating me like a resource instead of a daughter. Until that happens, we're done." I closed the door before they could respond. Through the wood, I heard my mother say something angry to my father. Then I heard their footsteps retreating down the hallway. They didn't come back. 6 months later, Emily and Marcus got married. The wedding was much smaller than my parents had originally planned, held at a modest venue that Emily and Marcus paid for themselves. The Morrisons had agreed to move forward with one condition: Nicole must be invited and treated with visible respect. "We'll be watching." I received my invitation in the mail like any other guest. When I arrived at the ceremony, I was seated at a family table for the first time in years. My parents were polite to me throughout the event, painfully so, their smiles careful and their words measured. They knew the Morrisons were observing every interaction. It wasn't warmth, it was performance, but something fundamental had shifted. They needed my cooperation now to maintain whatever was left of their image. I didn't need anything from them at all. After the ceremony, while guests mingled and music played softly in the background, Emily found me standing alone near the garden. She looked beautiful in her wedding dress, but her eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the long day. She didn't offer dramatic apologies or tearful confessions. She just spoke quietly, honestly, like she had been rehearsing these words for months. "I've been thinking about everything," she said. "I didn't know about the 20,000. I swear I didn't. But I knew Mom always asked you for money. I knew you always paid. And I never once asked why. I never asked if you were okay. I just took what came to me and didn't question where it came from." She paused, and I saw something in her face that looked like genuine shame. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking if we can try to have a real relationship." Slowly, without them orchestrating it. I looked at my sister, really looked at her. And I didn't see the golden child anymore. I saw a woman who had grown up with the same broken parents, shaped differently by the same dysfunction. She hadn't escaped unharmed. She had just been harmed in different ways. Slowly, I agreed. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a door left slightly open, Mrs. Patterson remains my emergency contact on every form. She's my Sunday dinner companion, my proof that family is defined by presence rather than blood. When I officially updated my medical paperwork after everything that happened, the administrator asked me to specify my relationship to her. I smiled and said chosen family. She wrote it down without question. I still work my job live. My life maintained my quiet success. The difference now is internal. I no longer hide from guilt. I no longer pay for peace. My parents haven't truly changed. They still make comments about that night at the party. They still frame themselves as victims of my cruelty. But they've lost their power over me. No more silent extractions. No more weaponized disappointment. The pattern is broken because I stopped feeding it. I used to believe that if I gave enough, sacrificed enough, stayed quiet enough, my family would finally see me as something more than useful. I thought love was supposed to cost something, and I was willing to pay whatever they charged. But I was wrong. Some people will never see your value. They'll only ever calculate your usefulness. The moment you stop being useful, you stop being visible. I learned that in a hospital room at 3 in the morning, scrolling through photos of my family's smiling faces while my stitches were still fresh. I didn't defeat my parents. I didn't get some dramatic revenge. I just stopped. Stopped giving. Stopped explaining. Stopped apologizing for having boundaries. And I built a different kind of family. Smaller, quieter, but real. People who show up not because they want something, but because they want me. That wasn't revenge. That was just finally choosing myself. And after 36 years of being someone else's budget line, choosing myself was enough. Thank you for listening to Nicole's story today. Before you go, I want to share something important that this journey teaches us about family boundaries and self-worth. Nicole's experience reminds us that love should never come with a price tag. When someone consistently takes from you without gratitude, when they dismiss your pain to serve their own interests, when they see your success only as something to exploit, that is not love. That is transaction. And you have every right to close that account. Setting boundaries with family is one of the hardest things any of us will ever do. We are taught from childhood that family comes first, that blood is thicker than water, that good daughters sacrifice without complaint. But here's the truth. No one tells you boundaries are not betrayal. Saying no is not cruelty. Protecting yourself from people who harm you, even when those people share your last name, is not selfish. It is survival. If Nicole's story resonates with you, if you have ever felt invisible to the people who should see you most clearly, if you have ever given until you had nothing left and still been asked for more, please know this: you are not alone. Your feelings are valid. And it is never too late to stop being someone else's budget line and start being your own priority. I would love to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family? What did Nicole's journey mean to you? Please share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this video touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. We share new stories every week about strength, resilience, and the courage it takes to choose yourself. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourself, and remember, you deserve people who show up for you, not just for what you can give them,